Welcome to the Sunday Shot, everyone. It's great to be back with you for your Sunday morning fix of all things political after really what felt like, I don't know, a year-long week of things happening both here, but I think particularly overseas. I'm joined again by my co-host, the editor of The Shot, Dave Milner. Hello, Dave.
G'day, Joe. Episode 2. How are we feeling today?
Feeling a little bit more relaxed. We're not going to be so hard on ourselves about the technical issues. If things go a little bit wrong, we know that our audience is very forgiving.
I also think these technical issues are charming. You're not going to find that on the ABC. It gives it a homegrown feel. You're not going to find lots of things we do on the ABC.
That is right. Now, before I introduce our panellists for this week, let's reflect, I think, on the latest developments in the regime change that is going on in the US. It feels like after nearly 80 years of NATO, an alliance which was forged on the bloodstained battlefields of Europe during the Second World War, America has switched sides. As Mr. End of History Francis Fukuyama put it in US publication Persuasion, the United States under Donald Trump is not retreating into isolationism, it is actively joining the authoritarian camp. So we're watching on the sidelines as the world retreats from a multipolar pre-World War II international framework where instead of even a facade of rules-based orders, big countries are getting together and doing deals, carving out their spheres of influence and deciding the fate of smaller countries. Russia and China have long asserted this, but America seems to be joining them, and it is a terrifying thing, not the least for the Ukrainians, who Trump this week also tried to shake down by demanding control of half of their critical minerals. Now, joining us to discuss these and other developments is lawyer, writer and author of Working for the Brand, Josh Bornstein, and commentator, novelist and writer Jane Caro. Josh, Jane, welcome to the Sunday Shot.
Good morning, thank you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Now, it does seem that we are watching history in the making with what's going on in the US and the geopolitical changes which are happening as a result of Trump, Musk, Vance and the others of that cohort. Australia doesn't really seem to know how to handle it. It was interesting that actually it was Dutton who came out this week and said that, you know, Ukraine needs to be at the table and they can't be just left to pick up the scraps. And it's Albanese and his government who seem to be being very cautious, probably because they're waiting to see what happens with the tariffs and the exemptions there before they make any kind of commentary. It's a funny old time.
Doesn't this fit the pattern, though, that over the last 15, 60 months of some horrendous American actions, Albanese hasn't said anything?
Yeah. Jane, what are you thinking about the tumult through which we're going at the moment and how Australia is best positioned to try and respond?
We're in a very difficult situation. I do have some sympathy for Albanese, actually. I mean, what a horrifying situation to suddenly find yourself in. The thing that really put the wind up me this week was that Chinese exercise coming so close to Australia and New Zealand and apparently using live firing without warning us. That to me is a clear intimidatory message being sent by the Chinese to the Australian government about our place, which is minor, which is you get to be who you are because we allow you to be. And I think that Albanese, hopefully, and presumably Dutton, are very well aware of this fact that we are incredibly vulnerable. If you think about Australia in the 250 odd years since European conquest, we have always been under the protection of a big power. For the first 200 years or so, it was the British Empire. Since then, it's been the Americans. Now the Americans have basically, no one can rely on them for anything. We are, for the first time in our European history, out there in the Pacific, literally on our own. The Chinese aren't stupid, they know that. We need to recognise that we have to tread carefully. I don't think being bellicose is actually the right thing at the moment. Yes, it is absolutely incumbent on whoever leads us to stand up and say when Donald Trump does something outrageous. But they will also be cognizant of the fact that they need to maintain our independence and also our economy. This is going to be incredibly difficult. So I don't want to come launching in on my idealistic charger in these extremely dangerous times. It is going to take cool heads and a really strong idea of what our priorities are to navigate our way through this upending, really, of the international order of the last 70 years, the long peace, particularly in Europe, as so many people have called it. We're back in the 1930s again. History is repeating. People saying this all the time.
Yeah.
I'm scared.
Look, I think it is scary times, and it was interesting that Dutton is not normally known for being measured. I mean, he does like beating the drum and being bellicose, but I think everybody's taking a bit of a breath when it comes to international relations. I mean, the way that we responded to China when they were unilaterally imposing tariffs on Australia is quite different from, though, the quite cautious approach that we've taken with America, not standing up to a bully in the case of Trump, which Malcolm Turnbull says is a mistake, that you should actually be prepared to go toe-to-toe in quite assertive ways, as we did with China, firm and clear, not bellicose particularly. Josh, do you think
Yes, it was bellicose to begin with. That's why they happened. That was Scott Morrison carrying on like a...
No, I think the bellicosity came about from people like Morrison and Dutton.
Bellicosity
of war, and they got pissed off with us. But then once the tariffs had happened, we were very firm in the way that we handled them. There was no sense that we weren't going to be running a commentary. We were just going to hope that we got exemptions or that they changed their mind. There was a very concerted diplomatic push that happened against the Chinese, which isn't happening at the moment, Josh, against the Americans.
I think what we're seeing, we've got to look at this more globally. I think we all agree 70 years of an international order is being thrown out the window, and I think there is shock all over the world. So yes, Australia is, its government is taking a muted approach at the moment, but it's got a lot of company. Europe is in absolute shock and turmoil, and what's unclear at the moment is who is going to lead the charge against American foreign policy and what's going on. And Australia, I agree very much with what Jane said. I thought it was impeccable observations, Jane, but there's also the issue of AUKUS.
Mm-hmm.
And we're now in shock, I think, because perhaps we shouldn't be in shock, but we are. We're in an alliance with what looks increasingly like a fascist regime.
And we're also paying this fascist regime hundreds of billions of dollars to receive submarines that we probably don't need and definitely won't receive.
So we should write off the 800 billion and go back to the French. But look,
but
the
that's
one thing
profound, isn't it? It's extraordinary to think that.
But that's probably what we should do and may well end up doing. I think the other point to make is Xi Jinping, for all his faults, is sane. Dealing with Trump is not dealing with a dictator. You are dealing with someone who is completely unpredictable, who has made his reputation by being unpredictable. And so it is much harder to do what was done with Xi Jinping over the tariffs that were placed on Australia then, now. Because what Albanese is trying to do at the moment is not do what was done by Morrison, which is be bellicose and then get them placed on us. He's trying to do what got them taken off us by the Chinese, which is to tread softly to stop those tariffs going on steel and aluminium in particular, but a whole lot of other things. He may fail, in which case I hope we react the way that Canada has, and I hope a lot of that comes from the Australian people, as it is in Canada. I mean, I remember when the French bombed Mururoa Atoll, and the French were convinced that this was all the protests in Australia and New Zealand were orchestrated by Paul Keating for political purposes. And of course, they were completely wrong. It was the Australian people who reacted. Keating at first wanted to tread softly. So I'm hopeful if Trump does impose those sanctions and tariffs, that Australians react the way the Canadians have done, and that the whole world does that, because that will have a powerful impact, more powerful than countries, being bellicose.
I don't like to say this too often, but I do think Malcolm Turnbull has a very good point when he talks about negotiating with Trump. And this is less about diplomacy and more about his narcissistic personality type. He will not respect the way we are dealing with him whatsoever. And again, it's a continuum.
Doesn't respect anyone.
Well, he doesn't respect anyone, but I do think it's not this binary switch. You can actually make moral value statements that leaders of nations should be saying, especially when they're so horrifically breached like they're being at the moment. Like America's mask off saying, yes, we're going to ethnically cleanse Gaza. I would expect some sort of political leader with a spine to say something about that. You don't have to jeopardize the entire relationship, but you can say something about that. And if you can't, what are you doing?
I do think one of the things that I think it was reported on in the New York Times this week as well was that there is, as we discussed briefly last week, this idea of, the madman theory that Nixon developed, which is just try and destabilise everything so that you then have leverage because people are so afraid of what you might do that you have no boundaries. But another point that was being made that actually tariffs... yes, it could be a negotiating tactic just to try and get more out of deals, but in fact America is broke, and that these are actually revenue-raising measures as well, because with the huge deficit and climbing that the US has at the moment, coupled with the massive tax cuts that Trump wants to extend for his billionaire mates, is that they are broke and they have no actual way of replenishing the Treasury coffers, and tariffs is actually part of that as well.
Plus, they've given the keys to the coffers to Elon Musk, and now he has America's money as well.
Yeah. And
haven't they just tried to raise the debt ceiling to some extraordinary figure? Isn't that coming up this week in the Congress?
Well, I think that is going to be a big crunch time with whether or not the Congress, because, a lot of those sort of ginger, hard right Congress, Republican congressmen and women are saying, we've got to get the debt under control, and they didn't want to raise the debt ceiling. So who knows? Look, it will be interesting times, absolutely, in the US. Part of what we do seem to be following here as well is the sort of obsession with migration and using immigration as a racist tool. Now, we know that's Dutton's playbook for some time, but what does seem to be interesting is that the Albanese government is in their kind of, maybe the election's coming, let's clear the deck so that nothing about migration can be used against us. And so this week we saw them matching the coalition's policy about foreign investors not being able to buy houses here in Australia for 2 years. It is interesting that so many key domestic policies get viewed through and talked about through the prism of migration. Josh, any thoughts on that?
Look, I think it's an interesting question whether foreign investment is in the same realm as migration. You could argue foreign investment sits in a slightly different category. The government has been hammered about the housing crisis, cost of living crisis, and in the lead up to an election, we'll be seeking to shore up its position on those fronts and to try and neutralise any attacks from Dutton about immigration. So that is just going to be a fact of the next few weeks or months up until, is it April 12 that we're all banking on, or is it some other day?
Passover, so April 12th
yes,
is firming up until then.
yes.
And so we'll see.
We've got to get up at Sunday morning until April 12.
Yeah, look, there are only 5,360 homes bought by foreign investors last year.
Yes.
So the idea that this is actually a major contributor
I-
to the housing crisis is ridiculous. And
No.
yet it is something that then clearly, after having rejected it a year ago, now the Labor Party have said, no, just in case they try and wedge us with it, we're going to jump on. And I heard Michael Sukkar being interviewed on Radio National this morning, and, Sarah was saying, look, 5,000 odd homes, really, is that going to make the difference? Shouldn't it be more about the number of homes investors have and the incentives that we have behind through our tax policy? And Michael Sukkar literally went on to say, it's not about who owns the homes, it's about how many houses are being built, which was, strange to say in the context of a conversation which was literally about who owns the homes. And also then to be saying that in relation, it doesn't matter who owns the homes when it's the fact that people are being shut out of the housing market that is the crisis itself, Dave.
This is just a politician's rhetorical nonsense. That's just flipping the script. Of course it matters who owns the homes. That is in fact the entire point of the conversation, because some people have 10 and 10 people have none. Like, that's a ridiculous thing for him to say.
I think too, I agree with Josh. And unfortunately, I think racism is strongly at play here, and it's being used politically. It's so tragic that has happened. And Jacinda Ardern, I think, banned foreign investment in New Zealand a long time ago in housing in New Zealand. New Zealanders can buy houses. I think there may be an exemption for Australians. I'm not 100% sure, but otherwise, no. I know the Finns are busily actually taking all the houses owned by Russians. So this is a worldwide phenomenon of get the foreigners out. We need to batten down the hatches here. But you hear people talk, who are trying to buy homes. Oh, there was someone on the phone from someone in Hong Kong and they got the final bid and now it's empty. And so there's these urban myths that fuel this idea that somehow, particularly the Chinese, are keeping Australians out of buying homes and sending the prices up. And so the facts, of course, are that that's not so. It's only 5,000 homes. But this then becomes the leverage that can be used for the government and the opposition to have a fight. And the government says, no, we are doing something about it because we're banning blah, 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 blah. And this is the problem with racism, that it gets used and the wrong people end up getting demonised for the problem. But it seems, tragically, the reason it gets used is because it works. I still remember the old days when there was a gentleman's agreement in the Australian Parliament not to leverage racism on both sides, and then Pauline Hanson came along and John Howard realised that he had to leverage racism, break that gentleman's agreement, and by gentlemen's, they were mostly gentlemen back then. And ever since then, it has been a race to the rancid bottom. Unbelievable.
2001 federal election when the Tampa
Yes.
was a turning point.
Children
as well.
overboard.
Yeah.
All of
All
that.
of
And
that.
it's been used again in education as well. Peter Dutton literally calling international students the boat people of our time.
It's just
and
blatant
Labor
racism. How does no
again
one call him out on this? Sorry, Joe.
But Labor
I actually missed that, Joe. Where
Sorry,
did
Josh,
Dutton
you go.
say that?
Say that
Where
again.
did Dutton say that international students were the boat people of our time?
So this was around the time that they were talking about the caps on international students, and so this sort of strange situation where the universities aren't funded appropriately, so they go out and they generate this massive export market, which in most other industries, like the gas industry, for example, exports are so important that we won't even have enough gas left over for our domestic consumption. But exporting in education is bad, apparently, and there are issues with having too many, have an unbalanced kind of demographic within the student body itself, certainly. But to come in with these hard caps without actually providing any alternative revenue streams is just causing chaos in the education system generally, and it seems again to be driven by the rhetoric that you can deploy to make it look, from the opposition's point of view, to make it look like the government isn't doing anything.
And also that our problem is not lack of funding in the universities, but these dreadful, overseas students coming in and God knows what all that it is they do apart from try to get a degree. But anyway, and also that term boat people always makes me jerk. After all, the bloody hell are all Australians, if not bloody boat people. But that mostly those people who originally earned that dreadful term were refugees fleeing horror.
Yeah.
And
who were at the time welcomed in by Malcolm Fraser when we did have that gentleman's agreement that you referred to.
And Malcolm Fraser,
earlier.
yeah.
The theme across both of these linked discussions, and this is a tale as old as time, is that you have rich people in the establishment creating a problem either by underfunding or rigging the game, and then instead of this, you blame it on poor people, you blame it on immigrants, and it works. Whoever it is, just someone else, just someone other than the richest people doing the exploiting.
Well, it's the same in schools, because one of the biggest revenue raisers for public education is, in fact, international students. And they tend to go to public schools in Australia, not private schools. And that helps. They pay full fees to go to those public schools and learn. And that is an enormously important revenue for a chronically underfunded school system.
So if you're a non-resident and you're here with your family and your kids go to our public schools, go to a public school, you have to pay a full fee.
Yes, if you're a non-official resident. That's one of the reasons why, for example, refugee students have a terrible problem, because often they've missed years of education because they were in internment camps and things like that. So they might be 16 and they go into year 7 so that they can catch up. And then by the time they turn 18, all funding goes for them and they get kicked out of school, and they might only be in year 9 because they've reached the age where they're no longer subsidised. I'm on the board of the Public Education Foundation, and we have an actual scholarship which helps fund those students and keep them in school and helps them into university. The Australian public, the Australian government, deserts them. We are
in the meantime,
appalled.
of course, one of the great untouchables in Australian politics is the outrageous funding of private schools by the federal government. In the interview
and states.
And states. And the interview we did with Richard Dennis last week, and he was talking about the cautiousness and, if not cowardice, of the current the government about tackling tax because they'd overlearned the lessons of 2019. And it seems to me when it comes to private funding or funding for private schools, we have overlearned the lesson of 2004 when, of all people, Mark Latham was trying to actually do something about the inequity, lost dismally, and so now it is just a sacred cow.
There's no evidence that policy was the cause of Mark Latham's demise. In fact, the only evidence I've seen is that it was quite popular and people thought it was a good idea. It just became the thing to blame. Yeah. Personally, I'd blame Mark Latham.
I think
you can trust the Labor Party to learn the wrong lesson from election defeat.
But even if it was the cause, let's just take that was 2004.
Yeah.
We're now in 21 years later.
Yeah.
Politics and policy doesn't freeze in time forever, and so it should be open to whatever government, whatever politicians to.
Also reminded of the handshake where he tried to crush a much smaller older
There was that.
Might have been a factor.
There was the taxi driver too. Let's not go back there. You are absolutely right, Josh. It shouldn't matter either one way or the other. But and we're really in a situation now where what we're dealing with is an incredibly powerful lobby group, which is led often by the churches, particularly the Catholic Church. Also, just about every wealthy and influential person in Australia sends their children to private schools. Most of the journalists do. Unfortunately, we have really convinced the Australian public, and this is neoliberalism writ large, that, good parents send their kids to private schools, bad parents send them to public schools, and certified bad parent here.
Certified bad parent.
Yeah, and we are an outlier in the whole world. Most Australians have no idea about this.
Yes.
No other country in the world funds private schools the way we do, with public money, with no reciprocal obligations for the universal education of all students. Those two things, parental choice and compulsory education for every child, are in direct opposition to one another, and the people who get punched down on are our neediest and most disadvantaged children. They're the ones who miss out. 80.5% of them go to public schools. Every single school they attend is underfunded. There are people who lobby for public education, but we're not the churches with all their money and power. And Labor runs scared because every election, if they promise to do anything for public education, the Catholic schools will get a letter home. They're going to take money off your school. They're going to get money off your school. Honestly, it makes me, I believe Australia is as blind to the damage that our funding of education does, our segregated system based basically on social class, and the way we overfund the wealthy and underfund those who would actually get some benefit out of that funding. We're as blind to the consequences of that as Americans are to their lack of gun control. We cannot see it. We refuse to see it.
Yeah, it is just, we are, and I think whenever I raise it in my social circle, and there are, progressive people who, as soon as
most of them,
age, they send their kids off to these private schools. I'm staggered by the way some people have portrayed their principles on this, but raising it, you get as much blowback as I have ever got from my
Oh, it's the worst.
It's so personal when it comes to kids.
It's not just the government running scared because of this. That's where they're sending their kids to.
Can I just say, I'm not here to defend Anthony Albanese, but it appears I am. I was at a lunch last year for the Public Education Day lunch. Anthony Albanese spoke. That's unusual in itself that a Prime Minister would speak at that. And what he spoke, part of what he spoke about was what a wonderful education his son had entirely in New South Wales public schools.
Yeah.
The whole room was absolutely... We've never heard a Prime Minister speak like that about public education. And I think
part of it as well is that we know that the educational outcomes are no different, but what people are actually doing is buying social capital and networks and influence.
Public school kids do better at university.
Yeah.
They always have and they continue to. God knows what the parents are buying. You're right. Status.
They know how to research themselves. Dave, we're going to go.
And if they get to university, it's because they want to go and they're... And
they've been motivated. Dave, we're going to go to your fabulous interview with Sarah Schwartz.
Let's do that then.
Do you have anything you'd like to say before we...
I think it's fairly self-explanatory, but had a nice chat with Sarah during the week about, I guess, what is the most dangerous conversation in the world at the moment and how she navigates it, how we all need to navigate it. So let's go to that. We are joined by Sarah Schwartz, human rights lawyer, lecturer and head of the Jewish Council of Australia. Thank you for joining us on the Sunday Shot.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
Zionists have been quite successful at equating Judaism and Zionism as synonymous, and therefore anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli critique as synonymous. Why have they been so successful at doing that?
The Jewish cultures and traditions have existed for over 3,000 years, and I probably don't need to tell you and the listeners that, Zionism in terms of advocacy for a state, a Jewish state, is a new concept. Zionism is something that emerged in the late 19th century and initially wasn't supported by a lot of Jewish people worldwide. After World War II, that changed. And we have seen, really successful efforts, led by the State of Israel to, as part of its advocacy, as a Jewish state, to conflate Jewish identities with support for the State of Israel. And unfortunately, we've seen a lot of Jewish organizations, including large, representative Jewish organizations, also sort of use that conflation between Israel and Jewish identities. And actually, the name of our group, the Jewish Council of Australia, is harking back to the name of a previous Jewish group that existed in Australia called the Jewish Council, which my co-executive officer has written a book about. And that was previously the representative body for the Jewish community in Victoria, and conceived of racism in many of the same ways that we do, and wasn't a Zionist organisation. And so our name itself is sort of harking back to a time when the Jewish community used to be quite different and weren't necessarily all supportive of the State of Israel, and identities weren't wrapped up in the State of Israel.
There is a proud tradition of dissenting voices in the Jewish community. I mean, Norm Finkelstein's been saying this stuff for a very long time. Do you see yourself as part of that tradition as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I would say as well, like on many other issues, the Jewish community is incredibly diverse, and on this issue as well, it's no different. I was always raised as part of my upbringing to sort of challenge authority, to question, and this is very much part of the Jewish tradition, this idea of debate and questioning. And so, we aren't the first organisation, and we certainly won't be the last organisation to stand with for human rights, for Palestinian human rights, and opposed to the actions of the State of Israel. And I feel quite lucky to be standing on the shoulders of a lot of Jewish people who've come before me, and a lot of Palestinian people as well, who have been, doing this advocacy for many decades.
Where are we at? How do you see the lay of the land at the moment? Because I'm seeing lots of people that are daring to speak out and be brave, the way I see it, on the part of humanity, basically, and they're being ostracized, they're being driven from their jobs. We're seeing it in media quite a bit. How do you read the lay of the land?
Yeah, I think we're just seeing, it really feels like we're in the middle of a really large period of repression for people who support Palestinian human rights across all industries. Creative Australia's recent decision, I think is a really good example. But then we have seen so much other suppression of Palestinian voices, of Jewish voices, of doctors who support Palestine. The repression is really widespread, and so I think that we're seeing the beginning. I'm really concerned about, for example, the Parliamentary Committee into Human Rights just released its report into anti-Semitism at universities. And this is like an incredibly serious issue. And obviously we've all seen an uptick in anti-Semitic incidents. But this report recommends a definition of anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition, which is one that lists as one of its examples, criticizing Israel as a racist endeavor, or criticizing the formation of Israel, that can be considered to be anti-Semitic. And so if this definition is adopted by universities, which we don't know that it will be, but it is something that has now been recommended by that parliamentary committee, that would be incredibly concerning in terms of free speech. It essentially means that academics, students who call for, for example, a single democratic state where people have equal human rights, that could be seen as being anti-Semitic. And this is something that not just, and my Jewish colleagues who teach at universities would say, well, this would mean that some of my lectures would be considered to be anti-Semitic if I'm criticising the very foundation of the Israeli state, the way it was formed. And so, yeah, I think we're seeing the beginning of that form of repression. But we're also seeing at the same time, I think, a massive shift both within the Jewish community and within the broader Australian community, who are seeing this repression and seeing the ways in which voices in support of Palestine have been shut down and are like, have had enough of it.
That's where I was going to lead this. I was going to ask, this must be a little bit apparent to the average everyday person out there. And I think this comes back to accusations of anti-Semitism. We all know the story of the boy who cried wolf, and this isn't in any way to talk about, any way to diminish real, very dangerous anti-Semitism, but it being weaponized by the Australian Jewish Association and having that accusation flung around everywhere at people that are basically just saying, could we stop bombing hospitals? It's going to lose a lot of its impact and culture, and it's going to, I can't see that as making Jewish people safer. I think that's quite a dangerous position to be taking.
Yeah, I 100% agree. It's really scary. Like, I can't count the number of times that I've been called a Nazi collaborator or Nazi sympathizer. And I
Yeah.
know that, like, everyone that I know that is spoken out in support of stuff as simple as a ceasefire, the AJA is an organization that calls even Penny Wong, equates her to like vile anti-Semites. These terms that get flung around, it's yeah, like it's really devastating for me and for so many other Jewish people in the council who, grew up hearing stories of Holocaust survivors. We are like, for me speaking personally, like that's the exact reason why I'm so passionate about this work, that I've been raised to be opposed to genocide in all of its forms, racism in all of its forms. I see what's happening in Palestine. I think it amounts to acts of genocide, which is the highest crime of racism. And I feel compelled to speak out of it because of my own upbringing and history. And the fact that for that I get labeled an anti-Semite, a Nazi collaborator, it like diminishes these terms so that they start meaning nothing. And yeah, I find that incredibly depressing. I mean, it's not only depressing in terms of it shuts down like legitimate speech and people speaking out in support of human rights, but it's also, as you say, really bad for Jewish people. I don't think it's helpful for us that Jewish people are on the front page of the news every single day. I think that like there is a definite rise in anti-Semitism, and we've seen an uptick in anti-Semitism. Like there does also seem to be a lot, but then there's also a lot of media reporting saying that things are anti-Semitic when they're not, when they're support for Palestinian freedom and justice. And I think it undermines those very real anti-Semitic incidents to then be referring to, people like me and people who support Palestinian human rights as being anti-Semitic. It just means that I do really worry that where this leads us is a general apathy within the general public about anti-Semitism, and about racism. Like if you call everything anti-Semitic, the public is not going to be, they're not going to believe that they're real instances of anti-Semitism.
Where to from here? What's next? How do we keep making this better? Not just for Jewish people, but for kind, humane people that just don't want to see any more of this. And the other thing I should add, sorry, before we get to that, is that I've been on lots of those protests over the last 15 months or so, and you're right, there's always very, very strong Jewish contingents that, signpost it and sing it loud and proud, and it's just not something that gets highlighted in the media, and it really should.
I mean, where to from here is a difficult question. Like one really horrible thing that we're seeing in Australia at the moment is this weaponization of anti-Semitism, like going back to what you started with. And like this week there are laws in New South Wales Parliament, in Victorian Parliament, related to addressing anti-Semitism, none of which in my view are actually actually proposing any measures which address the nature of the anti-Semitic incidents which have actually occurred in Australia. Were and this type of like disparate treatment between anti-Semitism and other forms of racism. And I know that I've seen like a lot of Muslim groups recently speak out against the way that like Islamophobic incidents are erased and incidents of anti-Palestinian racism are erased and are not reported and not given the same sort of headlines in Australia. And then you see people like the Daily Telegraph just like chucking a like social cohesion grenade into the fire by like engaging in this like really, irresponsible reporting. And to me, like really seeming like they are trying to confect incidents of anti-Semitism and provoke that like anti-Palestinian and Islamophobic racism. And I think like that is all really dangerous. And if I like for our leaders, I think that like they really need to be aware of like where the community is sitting at the moment and the way in which they are feeding into all of this discourse by like constantly highlighting anti-Semitism but not highlighting other forms of racism, and then responding with measures that have nothing to do with anti-Semitism, linking it to the Palestine solidarity movement, to the protest movement. Like these are all things which breed social incohesion and division. And so like I am quite worried about what is happening in Australia at the moment. I think that is like really being fomented by our leaders not taking strong action, being, in my view, like particularly the Labor Party, they don't seem to be putting up a good fight against Dutton and the right when they're in terms of anti-Semitism, and like they are feeding into this stifling of Palestinian voices.
They must have some degree of awareness of, I mean, obviously they won't acknowledge it, but they must have some degree of awareness of the danger that they're walking everyone into. Because one thing I keep thinking is, as these politicians keep lining up to make statements condemning anti-Semitism, it would be very easy to replace those statements with blanket statements condemning all forms of racism. And as you say, I feel like that would lead to more, I hate the phrase social cohesion because it really seems like it's code for stop talking about the genocide. But I feel like it would lead to more cohesive society. But that's
Yeah. And if our government actually took a strong stance in support of human rights, like
nice.
let's be, let's be real. Like like people are looking at their phones and seeing like egregious acts and horrific like bombings, children dying, like what Israel is doing in Palestine is, in my view, like absolutely amounts to acts of genocide. And this has been, confirmed by a broad range of human rights organizations and individuals. And we still have our government, not making any strong statements when Trump gets up and like proposes a plan for ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, and still like there is no condemnation of that. Like if our government took strong stances in response to human rights, like that would be, that sends a really important message to the Australian people that like we stand like against all forms of human rights abuses.
Sarah, thank you very much for your time and for your awesome work as well, I must add.
Thanks so much, David.
So, Josh, you can hear from what Sarah is saying, the frustration that she's feeling as a member of the Jewish community about her voice and particular views being silenced. And that does seem to be something which is very pervasive throughout our society. And these are issues that you touched on in your book, Working for the Brand, where there is a kind of a cancel culture which goes on about unacceptable views. And oddly, on the issue of anti-Semitism here, there's a bit of a flip between what we normally see in terms of people being cancelled and freedom of speech versus, fighting back against repression.
When I was finishing the book, October 7 had just happened, and I had this fraught conversation with my editor about what do I do, because a wave of sackings and blacklistings was starting, and it could end up now a whole new book. In the end, I included a few examples, Antoinette Lattouf and others in the book, but since then there's been an enormous number of people cancelled, sacked, blacklisted. In America, a huge number of academics have lost their jobs, students have been blackballed, and we're seeing more and more of it in Australia right up until recent weeks with cases involving Peter Lawler, the cricket journalist, and now Creative Australia. And what I point out in the book is there's been a complete inversion of political sides on notions of cancel culture and free speech. The left, many on the left, argued cancel culture was a myth, didn't really exist. Insisted on their right to feel safe at all times when confronted with speech that was upsetting.
And describe cancel culture really as just holding people to account for things.
And that was about accountability, that's right. Now, and of course the right was ferociously critical of cancel culture, and now we see, Dutton is suddenly a champion of anti-racism. The Australian and the Murdoch press is suddenly interested in anti-racism, having for years fermented racism. Think
Specific type of
where Andrew Bolt was in the federal court not long ago, or several years ago, and the left, who are my people, are our people insisting on their right to protest, even if it does make Jewish people feel unsafe. And just to be clear, the feeling of a lack of safety and distress is very real for many Jewish people. And for reasons which are very, very complex, and probably we could speak for the whole program about that. But where I end up is your subjective feelings about your safety, which may be detached from reality, should not determine the speech rights of others. If speech is in fact harmful and is going to lead to violence, then we can draw some lines. Now, into that mix, what Sarah talks about, and I should disclose, I'm on the advisory board of the Jewish Council for full disclosure purposes. Sarah is one of the most courageous people I've ever met, because the Jewish community in Australia has become increasingly intolerant, particularly through its peak bodies, and at the same time as being increasingly intolerant of any criticism of Israel, which is considered to be a traitorous thing. It's very well organised and relentless. And so what we're seeing with all of these sackings, with Antoinette Lattouf, with Creative Australia, with the pressure on universities, is a very effective lobby group. And what they do, they're very well resourced, they're very targeted, is they choke an organisation's complaint system. And if you do that, if you bombard the ABC, if you bombard Creative Australia, the organisation doesn't know how to manage it, and the easiest, someone in the organisation, a brand manager or another manager will say, we've got to cut our losses, and the easiest way to do that is to decapitate the relevant person and punish them by depriving them of income. And so we're seeing this play out over and over and over, and we're going to continue to see it play out until we see proper leadership calling it out. It is a fundamental attack on liberal democracy. It's anti-democratic. It does sow the seeds of resentment, conflict, and worse. So you cannot, on the one hand, proclaim an interest in social cohesion while blessing or ignoring the fact that a lot of people are losing their livelihoods because they've engaged in legitimate political discourse. Nothing to do with anti-Semitism.
Josh, you touched on it a little bit then.
Yeah.
How do we... how is... The way I see it, this is becoming incredibly obvious, and you should be able to see this by now.
Yeah.
And so at that point, it should stop happening, but I don't think that's going to happen. As you said, we're going to need some people to stand up. How does this stop in the right way?
I mean, in the end, it's like any political problem. It requires people to organise and fight and persuade the politicians, notwithstanding the power and influence and success of the pro-Israel lobby groups. They're extremely successful. The community is pretty small. It's less than 0.5% of the Australian community. So it needs to be challenged, and its opponents need to work just as hard and just as relentlessly to try and moderate its incredible success. And so, the Jewish Council is sort of the first organisation of its kind to start to say, this is what really anti-Semitism is about. This is legitimate political discourse. Our opponents are confusing the two deliberately to try and silence any criticism of Israel, and this has got to stop, but we're early days in the struggle.
And it is what has been so disappointing, particularly in the last few weeks, is that it has been our cultural institutions whose very raison d'etre is about freedom of expression, whether with the ABC, the freedom of the media, and with Creative Australia. I mean, for someone who works in the arts, and we touched on this last week, for me, it's a reputation-ending decision that they took there. It is in their establishing legislation that they are supposed to uphold and promote the freedom of expression in the arts, and then they just crumbled at the first pressure that was brought to bear in such a significant way on such a significant issue. And then we learned this week that the National Gallery of Australia had also done something equally appalling where they had made this. So there was an exhibition, Te Pai Pai Roru, where the Gods Cannot Be Fooled exhibition, and there was a tapestry. So it's a woven tapestry that featured a whole range of different flags: West Papua, Aboriginal, Torres Strait, a lot from the Pacific. And the Savage Club, who were the artists, the collective of artists, were forced at the last minute to cover up the Palestinian flag, or otherwise the exhibit would be removed from the exhibition, because the National Gallery of Australia said it was a security risk.
Josh is 100% on the money. This is managerialism gone bonkers. And it is this idea that their responsibility is to the organisation above and beyond everything else, rather than remembering that their responsibility is to the art, to the greater good, to the outcome of the organisation. My observation of this era is that it's become the process era. All we're interested in is the process. Is the process correct? Did we tick all the right boxes? Have we, not offended anybody? Everybody's terrified of offending people. Obviously, not me, but everybody else is. And I don't understand why. Who cares if somebody's offended? If that's the worst thing that ever happens to them in their life, they're living a good life. But this is what organisations obsess about. Oh. And they've forgotten what they're bloody well there for.
We're at the point where we're
the process.
I condemn it as corporate brand management, and as corporate culture has and corporations become all powerful. It's infected universities, as we've seen for many years now, who now run like big business. It's infected the public service. It's infected the ABC, and so corporate brand management and its ethos now takes the brand is all powerful, and we will sacrifice the human rights of anybody and act illegally if we have to protect the brand. One of the other complications in all of this is a lot of these black brandings and sackings are illegal. Yeah. So how do we reconcile that with everything else?
But it's also this cynical. There's a part of me that says this is very clever, but it's very cynical. And that is the right, as you put it, Josh, taking the tactics of the left and totally kind of subverting and distorting them, but using them with that same kind of self-righteousness, which is the abiding sin of the left, of being self-righteous. Yeah. And now the right is adopting that and using it cynically, cleverly, and incredibly destructively.
And far more effectively.
Because...
And now the left's on the internet talking about, oh, you're offended, so what? Like, the role's completely flipped.
I've always said that, I'd just like to say.
No, and you're right. The thing that I can't get past is that now, I understand silencing journalists, that makes sense. Every authoritarian regime in the world does that. But censoring a fucking tapestry?
Then you've got...
Yes. That's a move of desperation, right? Yeah. And Sarah said this, we cut this from the interview a little bit, why the AJA in particular is so keen to silence any Jewish voice complaint is because it destroys the monolith myth that this is a culture that believes the same thing. And as soon as you hear one person complaining, that's not true.
That's it. I mean, and it's so ahistorical. There's a long tradition of anti-Zionist Jews. Primo Levi was an anti-Zionist Jew. Hannah Arendt was an anti-Zionist Jew. Many Israeli citizens are anti-Zionists or strongly critical of Israel. It is
Miriam Margolyes is doing wonderful work.
My hero, Norm Finkelstein.
Correct. I mean, there's a long tradition, but in the very and it's not like this in the States. In Australia, which is a much more insular community, much more impacted, I think, by the Holocaust as well, there is an attempt to shut any criticism down and to punish severely anyone like Anthony Lowenstein was expelled from the community. Sarah Schwartz has recently attacked and tried to do the same. The US Jewish community doesn't operate like that at all. So it's a very distinct part of the Australian Jewish community that we're talking about.
And Australians often don't like dissent. We are our besetting sin, here I'm analysing everyone's besetting sins this morning, is compliance. We tend to talk behind people's backs, but tug the forelock to the powerful in public.
Very
And
true.
warders and convicts.
I mean,
This
part of what
day.
you talk about in your book is the power of the big corporation. And I do think that we do tend to get caught up in sort of minor scuffles, focus on individuals rather than looking at the sort of systemic problems that exist, the systemic inequality that exists in Australia and is not being tackled. As Richard Dennis was talking about last week, is there's sort of a technocratic tinkering that can go on without actually fundamentally looking at big issues around inequality. And Dave, I think you were delving a little bit into some of the scale of the problem in this instance.
The scale of the problem, indeed. The way I see it, humanity has a number of overlapping crises, but if you solve the inequality, billionaire eat the rich crises, you solve a lot of the other crises as well. It's very inherently related. I did look at some brief stats. I know Josh will have more than this, but presently 1.5%, the richest 1.5% own 48% of the world's wealth. The world's 26 richest people earn much more than the GDP of Italy. It's quite absurd where we're at. And the way I see it, after decades of deregulation, of unfettering markets, it feels fairly inevitable that the richest person in the world would be able to buy the US presidency. It almost feels like it makes sense. Like this is where we're inevitably going to go.
Neoliberalism.
Exactly.
It's a second Gilded Age. In the first Gilded Age, Teddy Roosevelt was able to tame corporations and break up monopolies. Now we have monopolies and oligopolies dominating most of our industries in the US, here and elsewhere. And the question that's not clear to me now, I think the current monopolies like big tech, I'm not sure we'll ever succeed in breaking them up. Can we ever tame them? Because they are now multinational. Elon Musk is arguably the most powerful person in the world, and over time will make Rupert Murdoch look like a chorister. So,
Well, we may not tame them, but climate change will.
yes.
Well, they've still been able to buy the properties in New Zealand, though, prior to these laws changing. They've got
If New
bunkers in the
Zealand
South
still-
Island.
Indeed.
Well, actually, that is a good segue into saying next week on The Shot, we are doing a bit of a deep dive into climate change, and we'll be looking at what the stakes are at the next election for climate, particularly given with the regime change in the US and how we can cope as one country here. We've got some great guests lined up. Ket and Joshi and Polly Hemming are coming to us with an interview with Joel Gerges. We are coming to the end of our hour of chat. I'm going to ask what's the top tip for the coming week that you have? What's been on your radar, whether it's a policy issue or actually a book you'd like to recommend? I was at Sydney Theatre Company's fantastic production of Picnic at Hanging Rock at the Opera House on Friday, and I recommend it. Bit of a disclosure that my partner did do the adaptation, but it is nonetheless, it's gothic horror on stage in a way that you very rarely see theatre being used for what theatre can do. Josh, what's your top tip?
So my version of gothic horror is the final 2 days of the Latoufe trial against the ABC are on this week in Sydney on Thursday and Friday. It won't be dull, and it'll be broadcast on YouTube. And the other thing to watch out for this week or next is when is it going to be politically, journalistically, socially acceptable to describe what's happening in America as fascism? I'm waiting to see when the realisation dawns about how bad things have become in the US.
I mean, I think a lot of Americans already are. Some great writing from Anne Applebaum in The Atlantic on this issue.
Yes.
She's watched in Europe before, in Poland. Jane, your top tip?
I've got no tips particularly, but I would say watch the women in America. The one thing we keep forgetting is that what drives fascism is a desire to re-establish white, straight, male dominance. It's a very old-fashioned way of looking at the world, and what I am noticing is when voices speak up, the Governor of Maine just did, they tend to be women's voices who are speaking up and standing up to the bullying of Trump. And I think my tip is always watch what women are doing. Also, I'm noticing all over my internet feed, which I'm loving, a lot of clips from a lock, and I've just gone blank on his last name, who is a brilliant transgender comedian and commentator. And so watch the transgender community. They're not going to go quietly. And notice that it is the feminine that is being demonised so strongly. Not just women, but the whole idea of the feminine, things we describe as feminine, as being an equal and important part of how we look after the planet and one another. That is the attempt is to tread that into the dust.
Yeah, and that's when you have people like Zuckerberg saying we need a bit more of an influx of masculine energy.
Masculine energy.
Oh,
well,
I don't
he
think
needs some, that's
any more
true.
of that at all. Dave, do you have a top tip, or are you just looking...
I guess, no, I'm a weirdo, so I'm finding solace as I see America descend into mask-off fever. I'm finding some solace in reading this and realizing that actually they've just always been a bit like that anyway. So I'm finding comfort in that, strangely enough.
It's odd. Thank you all very much for watching us this Sunday morning, sharing your morning coffee with us. Thanks to our guests, Josh and Jane, and our producer, Denise Ravel, who's behind the scenes and who is the mastermind behind the daily and free True North newsletter. So look that up on Substack and subscribe if you can. If you're so inclined, you can visit the link in our comments and in our description, and you can buy Dave and me our morning coffee on Sundays, and that will help us keep the Sunday shot on air at least until the election, which, as we say, might be April 12, maybe not because that's Passover. We're not going to play those games. We'll wait and find out. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you next Sunday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.